Before we get into the episode, I just wanted to address some ways that you can help out your local community and also Jamaica. So, SNAP, at the time that I'm recording this, is cutting its federal funding. This is a deliberate decision on the part of the Republican-controlled federal government to deprive people of their SNAP benefits, which for non-Americans is how low-income people are able to essentially get money to buy food from the government. All of our taxes pay for it. It's a social safety net that is unfortunately contentious in our country because people don't believe that those in poverty deserve dignity or the ability to feed themselves the food that they want. And the lack of SNAP funding, which to be clear, absolutely exists. And there's Federal Reserve money for government shutdowns like this that is intentionally being withheld to starve American citizens. The majority of people on SNAP are children, adults with disabilities, but even if these were able-bodied men and women, nobody deserves to starve, especially not in a country as great as America, and this is a complete tragedy. And so I wanted to remind you that if you're looking for ways to help, the most important thing you can do is to donate money to food banks. Food banks are able to stretch a dollar farther than you can just by going to the store. A lot of people who are very well-intentioned are going to the stores or taking things out of their pantries to donate. I'm not here to dissuade you from doing that if you want to, but I am here to let you know that the best thing you can possibly do is to take money and set up a reoccurring donation in your community. Food insecurity affects all of us. It affects millions of Americans, and it has a trickle-down effect. Prices in the grocery stores may begin to rise because, again, grocery stores are heavily reliant on SNAP money to fund their business. So really being able to fund these food banks as a way to try to bridge that gap, it's very scary because a lot of food banks are coming out and saying, like, we just don't have, even prior to the SNAP cuts in 2025, a lot of food banks across the country are reporting shortages that they've never seen before. So if you have the ability to donate and you would like to, I highly encourage you to look up your community, find a food bank, and then set up a recurring donation. Even if it's just $5 a month, they can take that $5 and stretch it way further than you can. And it also allows them to provide food that gives the recipients dignity and choice. I think growing up, we may have had that thing where, you just take kind of old cans that your parents didn't want, and you'd bring them to school to donate. And if you didn't want to eat that, like, why would they want to eat that? There's a mentality that, beggars can't be choosers, but there is something already so indignant about being in poverty that having the ability to make your own choices about your food or to actually eat something that's delicious and nourishing can be very powerful. If you are going to donate food, make sure that you donate items that can be used in whole. So Kraft mac and cheese is one that people always turn to, but milk isn't shelf stable, and a lot of people don't have butter, so that requires them to go get separate ingredients in order to make the meal. So it's best that you donate items. Well, honestly, it's just best that you give money, right? I also wanted to draw your attention to a GoFundMe. A hurricane wiped through Jamaica last week, and unfortunately, as it affected some of my closest family friends. So I'm putting a link in the GoFundMe. Again, all of this is if you're able. I know times are hard, and I don't want to make it seem like I'm pressuring you in any way. If you don't have the ability to donate, don't feel bad. There are other ways you can give back to your community. But the GoFundMe does support people that, I know personally. It's very important to me to get this out there, and I want to use my resources. So the fundraiser is being run by Tasanique Henry. She's from Crawford, a small fishing village in St. Elizabeth, Jamaica. Their community has been severely affected by Hurricane Melissa, and many families are struggling to pick up the pieces. Homes have been destroyed, fishing boats are damaged, and unfortunately, some lives have been tragically lost. Nearby relief efforts aren't really hitting St. Elizabeth yet. And, I know people who their childhood homes are wiped out. They have elders, staying with family. There's still no electricity. And it seems like what's coming out of Jamaica is that it'll still take a couple weeks to get everything up and running. So if you have the ability to donate, please donate to this GoFundMe or another GoFundMe supporting Jamaica. I'm just, platforming this one because this does affect my family, friends, and people who I love dearly. And I want to always use my platform to try to help people. Again, I really want to emphasize, I know times are hard, and if you don't have the ability to donate, I know I've platformed like several causes on this podcast. It's never to make you feel bad. I just know that many people listening do have the resources to donate, and I've, seen GoFundMe's be able to reach their goal because of putting things on here. So I'd really like to see that happen for the sake of my loved ones. But moving on to talk about, I think, a very controversial and polarizing article that just came out of British Vogue. I am talking about, is having a boyfriend embarrassing right now? On October 29th, an author named Shantae Joseph published in British Vogue this article, and I think it's imperative that you read it. If you haven't read the article yet, pause. There's no paywall. I've linked it in the description of any place that you're listening or watching this right now. I don't like reading an entire article on the podcast, one, because it gets into like some plagiarism issues, and two, I like being able to pick out the things that will really dissect and go from there. But it's important that you understand the entire essence of the article. That being said, if you're not going to read it, the article gives several reasons on why people are feeling like having a boyfriend is potentially embarrassing, and it stems from the understanding that women's lives are augmented, typically negatively, because they have this boyfriend, where there's always been a social reward to kind of play into the status that you get from having a boyfriend. And I also really picked this article because I think it ties together a lot of what I've been saying for years on this podcast about girls with boyfriends and the way that society rewards you for being a woman in a relationship with a man, as treating it as sort of the utmost signifier of your worth. To me, this article was a reclamation of being proud to be single. I did have some pretty significant criticisms, which is what I want to get into, but there were a lot of parts that I really liked and obviously sounded like things that I've talked about on my podcast and talked about on the internet. Like, I know I've said this in a podcast before. I made a TikTok about it earlier this year, but I wish there was another word for being in a heterosexual relationship that didn't make it sound like I put up with a man who didn't wipe his ass. Because unfortunately, what so many women are expected to go through makes you, like, I don't know if embarrassing is the right word, but there's something I hate about the expectation of girlfriend, or how I'm supposed to augment my behavior. You guys know that I typically go live before recording my podcast because it is self-promotion. Hello. And I was talking about this frustration that I've been with my boyfriend for like 2 years. Well, a little over 2 years actually at this point. Like 2 years and 6 months. Yeah. Oh my God. Time flies when you're having fun. But we've been together and I get so frustrated, not with the relationship itself, not with him at all, but like the expectations that people put on me. For example, I like going to the club. I like going out and dancing. And I've had people look at me crazy when I'm in the club and I say, like, I have a boyfriend. And not because I'm doing anything crazy in the club, but they're like, oh, well, like girls who are taken should be at home. And it's like, yeah, there's literally, like, as a music lover, particularly as someone who loves like house EDM, there is quite literally nowhere else you can go consistently and reliably. Like there's like raves and there's concerts, but if it's just like a random Friday, Saturday, Thursday night, and I would like to go out and dance, and it's not even about the drinking, although I'm not, turning my nose up at that, but it's just like, that is, some music was meant to be enjoyed with your hands in the air and lights pounding and fog all around you, and that is the best way to hear the beat drop. And I love it, and I love to go out with my friends, and I love the process of like doing my makeup and doing my hair and picking a really cute outfit, and people are always so surprised to find out that like the number one way that I get there is Trey is dropping me off and picking me back up, and it takes me to Taco Bell afterwards. Or I even had a friend, I was out for a girls' night, and it was girls' night. So like I looked sexy, I looked cute, and she was like, she meant it to be complimentary, but she was like, oh, like I can't even believe he would let you out of the house like that. And it's like, first of all, I don't play about domestic violence, so it quickly turned into a lecture. But also I hate the expectations, especially when you start living with a man. Like, things get spooky, as I've talked about in past episodes. When you make it to the threshold of what society deems as your relationship is serious, for some relationships that's marriage, living together, being together a long time, having a kid, other women in serious relationships start to kind of let you into this club where they start to tell you genuinely some of the worst shit you've ever heard. And they think, like, women are definitely concealing what they're going through in the home and publicly presenting this image that they're happy with a man, because we're taught that our worth comes from men, and being partnered is the ultimate sign of, like, I've made it, I'm a woman now, I'm grown, I'm responsible. Like, there is a real disdain that we have for single people, particularly for single women, as not being serious, because in a, heteronormative patriarchy, we expect men to be the signifiers of a woman's worth. And so I think when you are a woman in a relationship who goes off the script and maintains an independent identity, a strong sense of self, whose life doesn't kind of slowly revolve around boyfriends. Like, I know last episode was a bit jokey. Well, it was like 100% jokey, and thank you for those of you who stuck through it. Sometimes a girl just needs to be a little silly and get some I don't know. I had a lot of fun. That was one of the most fun episodes that I've ever recorded, but I was talking about the deep frustration that I feel having lost so many friends to just some guy. Like, he comes into your life, he takes precedent over your relationship with your own family and your own friends, and you just kind of become a side player in his life. You adopt everything that he likes. And listen, like, when you're in a relationship, I think it's so important to make this distinction. I don't think that the patriarchy is pressuring us to be in relationships, because that's not how sexuality and romantic desire works. Like, if you are attracted to men, then you will want, like, romantic love with men. It is really a crime against humanity that patriarchy has perverted what romantic love means for men and women, that prevent them from having actual deep bonds. And, really exploring, like, the depth and the beauty of these connections. So I don't think that it's some, like, patriarchal conditioning that's forcing us to be together. I mean, yes, but that, like, innate human desire. And I know I talked about this in past episodes again, but this episode or this article just feels like tying all of these things together. It has always been so fascinating to me that in our society, if you say you don't have familial love, people will grieve with you. People recognize that something was taken from you, that your biological or adoptive family didn't treat you with the love and care that you deserved as a child, doesn't show up for you well as an adult, or that family members have passed away, and that, love that you have, like, they're not here with you on earth. If you say that you don't have friends, or you talk about how painful it was for an experience in your upbringing, or like at some point in your adulthood when you are friendless, people will grieve with you and mourn with you. But when you say, I want romantic love and I can't find it, because love, I think, unlike those other relationships, because we do have the concept of, like, found family. Even if the family that, this universe puts you with sucks, you can find your own family, and you can have friends that turn into mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, aunties, uncles, cousins. Like, that is not, family is not defined by blood. It is defined by, like, a deeper love than that. And you don't have to be related to the people who you call family, right? But when you say, like, I want that romantic love, then it's desperate, it's pathetic. And then paradoxically, we do live in this patriarchy that tells you that if you have not been picked by a man, like, you're an absolute worthless wastrel of a woman. And so I just wanted to make that point clear, because I think some people take this stance, and I've gotten flamed for this on the internet by pointing out that, like, you cannot intellectualize your desire out of that romantic love. Like, across continents, in different societies, across languages, our stories, our mores, our values point to the fact that we covet romantic love, in addition to the other forms of love that are essential for, like, enjoyable human experience. There is something about falling in love with someone or multiple people, whatever floats your boat, and having that reciprocated. And it's a beautiful, transforming, life-changing thing. And so I don't just think that you can throw your hands in the air and say, well, I don't love the conditions for what love is, and it's a stupid thing to want anyway. Like, I think you can say, obviously, we'll get into that. Like, this is, the men are very difficult to deal with. It kind of leads me into something that I've been thinking a lot for the past year, which is I think that at some point we're going to have to recognize the grief that's going to happen to a lot of heterosexual women or women who want to be partnered with men who are not able to find partners because of how unsuitable the boy dating pool is, right? If you look at all the data on younger millennials and Gen Z men, they are increasingly becoming more conservative, while young women are becoming more liberal. They're diametrically opposed in ways that aren't really reconcilable, especially because the type of conservatism that, Gen Z is being drawn to is like authoritarian, fascist, and seeks for these like really strong implementation of gender roles that puts women in a subservient role to men and seeks to take away their economic autonomy, their ability to engage in, no fault divorce, their ability to own property and own homes. Well, I guess that ties into the economic instability. And then, of course, you have young women who are not going for that at all, not to mention that girls are outpacing boys. And this is kind of this has been happening in the Black community for some time. So just a brief history lesson for you. The war on drugs incarcerated a high number of Black people, but it most profoundly affected Black men. I think at the height of the war on drugs in the mid-'80s, like 3 in 5 Black men in America were incarcerated. And so this caused what's referred to as gender imbalance in sociology. It refers to a phenomena where, as the name suggests, there's an imbalance in the heterosexual dating pool between men and women, which causes the groups to act differently. So in a scenario where there's like an equal number of men and women, and bear in mind that women just, I think, outnumber men in the world due to things like conflict, men's risk taking, so on and so forth. But when there's a roughly equal number, you see people enter into more like committed relationships. There's less competition over partners versus whenever there's a gender imbalance where there's less men and more women, men who already have the upper hand in a patriarchy now have this huge advantage because there's less of them. And so they get to be choosier with their partners. They don't choose monogamy or commitment, which is why we see like a higher number of, like man sharing, like babies out of wedlock can be traced back to the war on drugs and the influence of like gender imbalance. And so these things get absorbed in like these, when I say these things, I should elaborate more on the behaviors. These behaviors about and these attitudes that people were forced to adopt when, if you wanted to be partner at all, you essentially had to put up with a lot of bullshit behavior. If you wanted to date within your community, and again, like we're talking about the 80s, that get adopted into culture. And even now, because of like poverty, homicide, violence in neighborhoods and incarceration, there's still not an equal number of Black men to Black women. And I'm talking about adults. And that difference between the two starts to manifest as early as like 18. And there's no way to artificially put those numbers back, right? Like once, part of the population is lost to death or, long incarceration periods, they're not actively in the dating pool. And so that has led to a sort of decades-long issue where we see it affecting marriage rates in the Black community. And we see Black women who are achieving, we're kind of referred to as the most educated demographic in America. That statistic is a little more complicated than the name implies, but Black women are out earning Black men. They're getting more degrees than Black men. And so when Black women who are high achieving, college educated or beyond are seeking for equally yoked partners, not only is there just in general a smaller number of Black men to choose from, but there is a much smaller number of Black men to choose from who have the same credentials, I think, for lack of a better word that I can think of right now, which causes huge problems in dating. And now we're seeing that across all races in America because more women are going to college. And it's really the first time in American history that this hasn't just been happening to Black women. And I will put, let me just write down and make a note now that I will put a more information about girls and degrees and having more than boys, because I really think that it's some interesting reading for you to do after you listen to this article. And this is, consider this your introduction into a topic you may not have learned about before. Don't take this as like the end all be all of where you need to stop researching. But now across all races in America, we see girls outpacing boys. And so it's going to be difficult for, especially a group of women who are economically high achieving, college educated, to want to find like-minded partners who also espouse those same liberal values. And this was a very long-winded way of saying that I'm not sure that everyone is going to end up partnered. And what do we do about that eventual reality? And I, over the past couple of years, have been taking note about different cultural moments where we sort of begin to confront this reality about how we're going to do it. And one way that I think we're sort of getting to that is having a boyfriend embarrassing now, watching women sort of publicly throw away this idea that a man is needed to complete their worth. Because I should just go back to the Black community thing. Many Black women were forced to settle. There's very much in our culture this issue of, you think you're too good for, and you think you're all that. And it's not, I think, as prevalent as I've noticed with my friends of other races in their communities to find a partner who can do what we traditionally code as masculine, like being able to provide or even being able to have a job, just because having a man is more important. And so it's important when we talk about the influence of this on the Black community that it's also a very patriarchal community. So it's interesting to see like women reconciling with the patriarchy part as it becomes more abundantly clear that maybe not everyone who had otherwise desired to end up in a heterosexual relationship will end up with one. My long-term prediction, if you're curious, is that I think at some point we're going to have to confront that. I don't think society is well equipped now, just because if you talk about how sad you are when you're single, people gaslight you. And I've said this in past episodes, but I've never understood the point of calling people desperate for wanting something that is very much coded into our DNA. We are companion mammals. And again, I do think that romantic love is just a requirement, one of the things that we need. You can certainly live without it the way you can live without friends or family, but I don't think someone is wrong for expressing that desire. Right now, I don't think we're equipped to address that grief, but in the future, I think we'll be able to. And so now, after 22 minutes, to finally turn to the article, and hopefully you have read it, because I wanted to go over I don't know, just a couple of standouts that I think hit home the point of the article. So the first part references a Substack from Josh Laura, Tell the Bees, who I'll put the article Boyfriend Land in as well. I think it's incredible. I'm also a huge fan of that Substack, and just a humble brag, but we are, mutuals on social media. So that is like my very parasocial. It always makes me feel, I don't know, it's very cool because I think Josh has a lot to say. But he has this article called Boyfriend Land. Quote, a world where women's online identities centers around the lives of their partners, a situation rarely seen reversed. Women were rewarded for their ability to find and keep a man with elevated social status and praised. It became even more suffocating when this could be leveraged on social media for engagement, and if you were serious enough, financial gain, unquote. And so the article then goes on to talk about, how people show their partners on social media. I'm not super interested in that point. I think there are a lot of reasons, honestly, why people keep their partners off of social media. I will share that I definitely shared Trey a lot more on my Instagram before I made a take on someone on TikTok that someone disagreed with. And then they started sending him a bunch of crazy messages, which is why I usually go out of my way to not having that. And that happened multiple times. And it was like, okay, this is, I don't know. Ugh. So the article talks about evil eye or jealousy. I don't believe in that. The article is quite preoccupied with the social media part, but to get into the next, iteration, quote, "So what gives? Are people embarrassed by their boyfriends now? Or is there something more complicated going on? To me, it feels like the result of women wanting to straddle two worlds, one where they can receive the social benefits of having a partner, but not appear so boyfriend obsessed that they come across as quite culturally loserish. They want the prize and celebration of partnership, but understand the norminess of it," says Zoe Zamandi, writer and activist. In other words, in an era of widespread heterofatalism, women don't want to be seen as being all about their man, but they also want the clout that comes with being partnered, unquote. And then we're going into another passage. There was another overwhelming sense from single and partnered women alike that regardless of the relationship, being with a man was almost a guilty thing to do. On the Delusional Diaries podcast, fronted by two New York-based influencers, Hallie and Jazz, they discuss whether having a boyfriend is lame now. "Why does having a boyfriend feel Republican?" reads a top comment. "Boyfriends are out of style. They won't come back in until they start acting right," read another with thousands of likes. In essence, having a boyfriend typically takes hits on a woman's aura, as one commenter claimed. Funnily enough, both of these hosts have partners, which is something I often see online. Even partnered women will lament men and heterosexuality, partly in solidarity with other women, but partly because it is now fundamentally uncool to be a boyfriend girl, unquote. Okay, so this passage, definitely me. I am a partnered woman who definitely laments online and has built her brand online about lamenting about heterosexuality and being in a relationship. And I think a reason why both online and whenever I'm trying to make friends with women that I don't lead with like, "Oh, my boyfriend, this, my boyfriend, that," is not because he's not a big part of my life, but because the worst heartbreak of my 20s has been losing my friends, women that I thought, I'm talking about women that at one point I considered to be like, sisters to me. Like we were so close. I love them so deeply. They were with me for like, really important parts of, growing up and college. And then this guy comes in and he's suddenly more important than anything else. And there is something fundamentally untrustworthy about girls who are in boyfriend land. There is, because they'll ditch you in a hot second and they only want to hang out with you. Like word to the wise, once a friend ditches you for her boyfriend, never take her back. She will stick with you for as long as she's single. And she's probably treating you as a proxy stand-in for her man. Like she's calling you all the time. She wants to hang out all the time. And you think like, "Oh, cool, we're the best of friends." And then the moment she gets into a relationship with that man, like she stops existing and she starts only existing for him. And so in a way, trying to talk about these things is a way for me to signal to other women like, "Hey, at no point in our friendship am I going to betray you and suddenly make my entire identity about my boyfriend." Like I would never do that. I actually think it's fucked up when people do that. And you cannot have deep, fulfilling relationships with women who do that, especially the older you get, because they will start to settle down and then, God forbid, you stayed friends with them. You're just kind of expected to be like a stand-in for their big milestones, even though you have no like close, like I've seen it happen to people where they're not close to a girl, but the girl just simply doesn't have any close friends because she spent the past couple years of her relationship like just being an extension of him and not being her own autonomous person. And she's going to try to excise like all of the former closeness she had with those women just so she can feel good on like her wedding day. And then she's never going to talk to you again. Again, get out of it now. Do not take that girl back when she does that to you because it never ends well. And I guess I disagree with part of the argument that it's fundamentally uncool to be, well, it is fundamentally uncool to be a boyfriend girl, but I think I'm trying to convey that less because I care about like the coolness, because I already think I am cool. I know you're not supposed to say that out loud. I know that takes the cool away from it, but I do think cool is something that I've mastered, princess. And, but because to me, it's a signal that I'm not going to betray other women. It's why I talk so much about like that episode where I was like, evil girls with boyfriends, and acknowledging, because when I was single, I felt like girls were being condescending to me. Girls were pitying me because I was single. I felt like girls were using, like they didn't see my life and my interests and my pursuits as legitimate because I hadn't been picked by a man yet. And I watched the attitudes change when I got like a serious boyfriend. And I knew when I was single that, again, like, women were hiding what they were going through behind closed doors. And I'm not, domestic violence isn't everything, and we'll get to that part, but I'm not just talking about violence. I'm just talking about, like, wow, like, he's actually not that great of a person. He's actually a piece of shit, but you weren't comfortable sharing that until you thought I was in the same boat, because women who are in fucked up relationships, like, no one is angrier about single girls. I know I've said this before on the pod, but I just need to reiterate here. No one is angrier about single girls doing what they want than girls in miserable ass relationships. And they take their misery out on girls in healthy relationships too, although they just tend not to believe that you're in a healthy relationship. Like, back to the weird expectations that came with being with Trey that had nothing to do with Trey is we lived together, right? We moved in together recently, and people think that I'm going to be his mom, which is crazy because, one, everything I talk about on the internet, like, there's hours of footage of me on this podcast talking about the domestic labor gap in heterosexual habitating couples. So why would you know that that's something that I'm passionate about and talk about often in real life, and then have the audacity to look at me in my face and be like, isn't it so annoying, like, having to do his laundry? And it's like, no, like, why the fuck would I do that? Like, why would we not be equal partners in this domestic situation? Also, because anybody that knows me knows that I have ADHD, and cleaning is something that is, like, I tell people that he does the majority of the cleaning, and they look at me fucking crazy. And it's like, oh my God, like, your personhood gets erased by society because of your proximity to a man. And it is frustrating the ways that you have to reclaim that. And also, like, I wouldn't be dating someone who expected that of me. I think that's sort of the unspoken part of is a lot of these guys want you to give up everything in your life. Like, that was a big issue when I was single and I was, dating, is I ran into a lot of men who would just say the quiet part out loud and be like, but why doesn't your life revolve around me? I had a guy ask me that once. He was like, Alexia, like, all my other girlfriends, like everything they did, it was kind of about me, and, like, you don't do that. And I was like, yeah, because I'm, like, in law school and I have my own shit going on, and, like, I have my own friends, and, like, you're a part of my life, but, like, you're not my whole life. Also, I've known you for 3 months. We broke up after that. But it's just very weird. Like, people also see my feminism as something that, like, he wouldn't be interested in, which is, like, people talk to him about my podcast and my social media presence as if he's supposed to be, like, paternalistic to me and be like, oh, that's a cute hobby, babe. And not like he's one of, if not the first person that I'm, like, constantly bouncing these ideas. Like, he's not a collaborator. Like, it's intensely frustrating the ways in which your boyfriend is just supposed to become everything, and men and women who don't want to fit into that. Because I'm emphasizing, if you're listening to this, that, like, men out there do exist who don't want the whole, like, submissive, shut up and just be pretty girlfriend who does everything to me. Like, I have a guy friend, I think I quoted him 2 years ago, but I'll quote him again. And he was like, no, that shit, like, really freaks me the fuck out. Direct quote. Because I'm looking for, like, a person. Like, I don't want to have sex with my mother. And it's like, yeah. And so I'm trying to signal this, to go back to the article, like, a partnered women who I'm telling you where I'm coming from is I'm trying to stand in solidarity with other women, because I don't, mostly fueled by, like, that betrayal. I don't think I will ever get over how bad it hurt to be discarded for some guy that you've known for 2 months. And they're never great, because no one who's great would ask you to do that. And so, to go back to the article, quote, from my conversations, one thing is certain, the script is shifting. Being partnered doesn't affirm your womanhood anymore. It's no longer considered an achievement, and if anything, it's become more of a flex to pronounce yourself single. As straight women, we're confronting something that every other sexuality has had to contend with, a politicization of our identity. Heterosexuality has long been purposefully indefinable, so it's harder for those within it and outside of it to critique. However, as our traditional roles begin to crumble, maybe we're being forced to reevaluate our blind allegiance to heterosexuality, unquote. Okay, this is probably one of the biggest issues with the article, saying that because heterosexuality is hard to define and therefore it's harder to critique, I think that is a show to its ultimate political power. It's very akin to the way that we discuss whiteness and white supremacy. Whiteness in itself is somewhat undefinable, but it is so powerful that all other racial categorizations are forced to define themselves around it. Like, we have tangible definitions of blackness, in part because blackness, as was formed in like the racial caste system of enslavement in the US, was specifically defined in opposition to whiteness being an actual human being and blackness being property and a subhuman type creature, right? And, as our culture has evolved and as Black people reclaimed, like, I don't even say reclaim, but define what blackness is for ourselves, it's still, of course, especially within the racial politics of America, like, whiteness is there, and it is power to say that like whiteness is ubiquitous, right? It is powerful that in books, when authors want to describe any character of color, they have to point out that a character of color, and when a character is raceless, it just means that they're white, right? It means something, that the designation of American in and of itself is the silent white American in front of it, because every other racial classification of American defines themselves as their racial designation first, as like an extra adjective onto their Americanness, therefore like definitionally making sure that they are othered. That is power. And so I found this part to be honestly ridiculous and not couched in like feminist history, like, oh, we're talking about the feminist sex wars again. But this has been something that's been discussed in feminist movements since the 1960s, and the discussion has never gone away. I'm particularly thinking back to like the lesbian sex wars and a lot of, writing and thinking that was coming from lesbians. This is important, who were talking about, not being partnered with men. And then you had people like Bell Hooks, I believe she just describes herself as a womanist, coming in and talking about what I'm saying with like, but there is, this desire to be like this innate desire to be loved in our sexuality. And so that's sort of the part, like, I don't know, the whole heterosexuality has never had to contend with its political power. When you are the default couple, when I know that my boyfriend and I can walk down the street and hold hands and nobody will threaten me with violence, that is political power. When I know that everything that ever has to do with couples addresses straight people first and foremost, gay people, if at all, as an afterthought, and, the many expressions of queer love, gender identities, gender bending, isn't even touched on at all in the mainstream, that is power. I hold a significant amount of social power because I'm in a relationship with a man as a cisgender woman, and he's a cisgender man, and that is powerful. And straight people aren't critiquing it because they're comfortable. It's the same reason why, you find some white people are reluctant to talk about white supremacy, not because they don't know what's going on, because white people are very aware that they don't want to be treated like Black people, but because it's uncomfortable to talk about the amounts. I don't know. That's like the nicest way. I'm trying to give them maybe too much benefit to talk about the amount of like absurd social power you hold over everyone else. Heterosexuality has not been purposefully indefinable for the purposes of political power. That in itself, like, it has always been man and woman, and not just man and woman, but man and woman who adhere to a very strict gender binary. Men who differ too much from the masculine and women who differ too much from the feminine, like especially politically for women who aren't seen as submitting to their husband, do lose a bit of that power, right? So also this idea that like straight women have had not to contend with the politicization of our identity the entire way that like being a wife and a mother has been co-opted for political purposes by everyone. Straight women have had to contend with that. I would argue that almost all of the modern issues that women have with motherhood and parenting stems back to this politicization of the heterosexual mother, whether she is heterosexual herself, because we see mother as this non-existent being who only lives to serve. We tell women to abandon themselves in motherhood. We actually see that as the most virtuous kind of motherhood that you can do, to completely give up your own autonomy, your own identity, in pursuit of this self-service to both child and man, but man coming explicitly above child. And the way that women have had to grapple with what does it mean to be a good mother, but I still want time for myself. Like, the moment you tell society you're pregnant, the moment you can be visibly clocked as a mother, your body stops belonging to yourself. All of your choices are open to critique. That is a direct result of patriarchy. Mothers grapple with that. It is the number one complaint that I see coming from mothers in my real life, online, especially when they're talking about these absurd norms that are pushed onto them. That is political. So this part of the article to me was bullshit. It just didn't seem well researched, and it has not been hard for people within it to critique at all. That's an absurd notion. I don't know. The author, again, I like the author's work, but liking something does not put it above criticism. The author is talking about, like, this is a new movement. I also don't think this movement is new. Women have been talking about this on the internet, especially for like the past 5 to 6 years. She's not the first person to come up with it. I'm glad that the article is doing so well for her, though. But just back to this one criticism, like, the idea that as our traditional roles begin to crumble, maybe we're being forced to evaluate our blind allegiance to heterosexuality also looks over the fact that what has allowed women to, like, it kind of erases the economic subjugation that kept women, quote unquote, like allegiant to heterosexuality. You have to, this is another criticism that I had with the article. You have to understand that, like, women were not just flexing like, oh, I have a boyfriend or I have a husband. And we'll get into the lack of husband in this article in a second. Because it gave them social power. It was also about signifying that you were economically secure, right? Like, we are only 40, 50 years, depending on the state that you live in America, for women being able to open lines of credit. We're only about almost 40, 50 years from women being able to exercise no-fault divorce, which prior to no-fault divorce, it was extremely difficult for women to obtain divorces, often leaving them with their abusers and no economic options. I've shared this story from my former coworker before, but I worked with an older woman who got married in high school, dropped out of high school to be with her husband, and he beat her every day of their marriage, and pretty horrifically abused her in other ways, so much so that the lasting effects of the injuries were evidence in her limbs, the way that she walked, and the chronic pain that she carried. And she was only able to leave him after her daughter turned 18, because the way that divorce laws in Pennsylvania worked at the time was not only would she not have received, any sort of spousal support, alimony, any sort of economic support. And again, this is a woman who didn't have a high school diploma, who had supported herself and her daughter by picking up odd jobs and relying on his salary, but she could have potentially lost her kid. What kept her in that marriage is he had the money for an attorney who threatened her into saying, like, we're going to take your daughter away from you. And she didn't want to leave her daughter and potentially subject her daughter to direct physical violence. So she stayed with him, and when she left him, she had nothing. Because that is maybe a different episode that I can't speak too much on because I don't practice family law, but the origins of no-fault divorce, although they're very helpful for women, did not help women in the sense that suddenly courts would look at stay-at-home mothers and say, like, well, she had the opportunity to get a job and she didn't. So we're not going to take into account her contributions to this marriage, domestically or providing childcare. And we're going to give the majority of the assets to the man, right? Because only 9 states in America are what's called community property states, which is where everything in the divorce is 50-50. The rest of the states in America don't work like that. It's heavily dependent on your state. Most people just think that because one of the community property states is California, where a lot of celebrities get divorced. And so we tend to think that's the norm. It's not. And so I always share the story with my coworker who has given me permission to talk about this. And she's doing very well now. Somebody asked me that once. She's doing very well. Her daughter is, a grown adult now. They actually live together. They're very happy. They have some beautiful dogs. We still keep in touch. But this article ignores the economic reality of I don't know. It makes it seem like women were clinging to this because they just loved feeling better than other people. And part of that was just rooted in safety. There was people were not. Heterosexuality has killed women, deprived women of being able to express their full, authentic selves, kept women in dangerous conditions, robbed women of, economic autonomy, financial autonomy. That's the same thing. It's not just a fucking blind allegiance to it, right? Your grandma did not. The women's labor rights movement, contrary to popular belief, didn't get women in the workforce. It started compensating women for the work that they had always done in the labor force, because only a very small group of women in America who are white, affluent women did not work. Everyone else worked, and they got paid fucking nothing. There was no equal employment laws that protected your right to get paid the same as a man, or allowed you civil remedies when you didn't. There were no sexual protection, sexual harassment protection. There were no gender protections, right? People thought women's labor was to be expected and not rewarded and not compensated, and that kept women in a lot of fucked up situations. The freedom that we have today is very much tied to our economic freedom, which is why you see governments who are so invested and who talk about these family values that always comes couched with economic oppression, wanting to keep women out of the workforce, trying to force women back into the homes, trying to propagate this idea that women are better off raised by their mothers in the home, coincidentally never fathers, because so that was lazy to me, to make it seem like all of this has been a choice, and that the material subjugation that women have been subject to did not embed itself in the culture, but to not look at the roots of that, which were about safety, right? Yes, these things are not just cultural. Patriarchy is not just a set of cultural attitudes. It is systemic oppression. It is choices made by the governments. So that, that was a huge miss of the article for me, to not even mention why women are able to have these conversations and to be able to entertain these ideas is not because women can have jobs and bank accounts and won't be destitute if they leave their husbands. We have better recourses for domestic violence in our society, and we recognize things like marital rape and domestic violence as a crime. It just, I don't know, that passage was dumb. Other criticisms that I have of the article, I took a list. Okay. I do find it interesting, and it was kind of affirmed by the reaction to the article, that husband was never mentioned, because really and truly, husband and boyfriend are the same thing. Husband just denotes culturally it's different, right? Legally, you could make an argument for spiritually it's different, but it's still a man in your life. And it's, I don't know, I saw some people coming away with the reaction that but having a husband's not embarrassing. And it still kind of, it would have been interesting, and maybe that can be a follow-up that we expect from Shantae Joseph, that addressing the husband of it all, because if anything, having a husband is a way bigger flex socially than having a boyfriend. Nobody will ever celebrate you as a woman than when you get married, except for when you become a mother, although that's a different type of celebration that comes with like a lot of shame and a lot of social expectations to kill your old self. You know, as I just talked about 10 minutes ago, your wedding is the most social attention that you ever get. People care more about your wedding than they do if you could win a Nobel Peace Prize, unless, of course, you lost weight. Then that's more important than the Nobel Peace Prize. And like, ooh, I don't know. Like, was the husband not mentioned because it just wasn't the subject of the article? Is there something deeper going on about the husband wasn't mentioned because it still in some way kind of relies on like patriarchal validation? Because I did think it's depressing that the article didn't push back against the idea that you're less cool with the boyfriend. And then in Shantae Joseph's Instagram comments and in her TikTok comments, she's liking comments, which as a creator, I always see the comments that you choose to like highlight with your like or pin is an endorsement of those thoughts. I understand that not everyone sees it that way. And so I'm giving this disclaimer because maybe she didn't see it that way. Right. But, she's liking comments where it's like, yeah, like I just automatically think girls are less cool. And it's like, so that doesn't, instead of seeing a girl as cool because a man picked her, you're seeing a girl as cool because she is foregoing a man's validation in a way that still centers a man's validation as like the ultimate indicator of worth. Like, I don't know. Okay. And I know that you're going to be like, you just don't like that opinion because you have a boyfriend. And I promise you, that's not what it is. Like, if anything, to me, I understand that this is a Vogue article, but if anything, to me, the whole cool part, the whole embarrassing part didn't touch enough on what like the actual embarrassment is. Like it talks about, posts on social media and not wanting to take down certain posts or not wanting to like go into la and like a lot of, I just don't want to post them all the time. And so I go to this passage. She interviewed someone for the article and they say, being single gives you this ultimate freedom to say and do what you want. It's absolutely not every woman, but I do notice that we can become more beige and watered down online when in a relationship, myself included. The passage is mostly talking about online presence, but again, I do think it's important to like beyond that, like the ways in which we're expected to contort ourselves and to be meek and less of ourselves, like the way that people have expected me, a person with a big personality, that somehow my personality would shrink when being with a man, and people have expressed genuine like surprise when I didn't do that. And instead of focusing more on that, it just focused more about like the posting, or it didn't go into like, it can be embarrassing as seeing as like giving up on yourself, or just not being a person anymore, in a way that I think is contrasted by, Boyfriend Land, what Josh Flora talks about, and is definitely one of the recommended readings for this week. I wanted to end it to touch on domestic violence, because I know Domestic Violence Awareness Month just ended, but there is a worrying attitude. I've talked about it in a past episode. I want to bring it up again. There seems to be this lack of recognition about the varying degrees that patriarchy can affect you, right? Whenever people on the left talk about the ways in which we're affected by systems, there's a recognition about privilege and just the privilege of being exposed to certain things, right? Part of the reason why I can get on this podcast and talk the way that I do about gender roles is because I was not raised in a sexist household, right? Like all of the women in my life knew and understood they were people, and they raised me on stories of the misogyny they faced. My grandma got a master's degree when it was incredibly unpopular for a Black woman to do so. And then people looked at her sideways when she didn't stop working as a teacher, which was sort of a female coded profession, obviously, to support my grandpa. And when she continued to pursue her career, even when having 5 kids, and she went on to become a principal, and she went on to become very involved with her district. And she got a lot of shit for that because people took it as like a sign of bad motherhood. My other grandma started her own business and people gave her a lot of shit for that. Like both my mom and my stepmom are pretty prominent in their respective fields. And I watched my stepmom go back to school and get her master's degree. My mom does finance, which is a male-dominated society. And so that was just a huge leg up to be raised by women who participated in feminist movements, who benefited from feminism, who taught that from me, versus a woman whose family taught her that she was a second-class citizen, that she eats less and last because she's a woman, that her ultimate worth is getting married, that her ultimate worth is having children, that she should get married early and often. And I'm not talking about women in faraway countries. Like, I'm talking about women in America. Child marriage, which is the when children can marry each other, but most often and most commonly, like 90% of the time, it's children, usually girls, marrying grown men. And by the way, divorce laws in America, you can't get divorced even when you're married under 18. So they're stuck with their abusers who are sexually abusing them, because grown men, until they're 18, right? Like, it is an immense privilege to say that I didn't face sexism in my home. Everything about like a strong personality, being intelligent, was rewarded and cultivated by my parents, that allowed me to be so outspoken and so confident in myself and a woman. And there seems to be this lack of recognition that, like, if you didn't have that, it is genuinely going to be harder to break out of the patriarchy. Like, if nobody at any point told you that you are a person until you are an adult, not because a man picks you, not because you're a mother, but because you're a woman, and that in itself is enough, we're not going to have the same fucking conversations until you catch up to me. I am more privileged than you in this respect. I don't understand. Again, I've talked about this in past episodes, but it's like a mean thing to look at women who didn't come from the advantage that you did and be like, fuck you, haha, I can't understand why, like, you think that having a husband is the most important thing you can do. And it's like, because she didn't have what you have. Like, it's not a conscious choice for everyone. Like, some of it is brainwashing. I don't understand how we can recognize that, like, patriarchal brainwashing is so powerful and so important, and then take every choice personally. Something that I struggle with. So, like, I'm not I'm not coming from like a high horse. Like, I, at times in this podcast, you could point out, like, maybe Alexia, you are not recognizing that. I'm trying to work on that and grow. But I'm saying that article, but also just a lot of discourse about, like, why women want to be, like, male-centered or blah, 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 blah. Like, it doesn't want to do a real investigation of the patriarchy. It sort of talks about, like, the patriarchy is this force that's not that powerful. And it is. I cannot emphasize enough how many women out there don't know they're human beings. How many women do genuinely believe that being single is the death of perhaps, or the only time that they got to be their authentic self, because what wifehood is, what being a wife is, what being a mother is not any of those things where you are allowed to have, like, freedom and fun. Which informs domestic violence culture. Domestic violence does not just take place in the context of relationships. We live in a culture that facilitates, encourages, and promotes domestic violence. It's in all our attitudes about jealousy and the way that we talk about, like, passion. And it shows up in the way we don't acknowledge that part of what pushes women, and I don't want to ignore the fact that men can be victims of violent relationships as well, but just talking about the patriarchal influence on domestic violence, there are so many women out there who do not know they're in abusive situations, or do not have the community or ability to escape their abusive situations because they're being punished through gender norms, right? Like, their, abusive significant other is essentially punishing them for being a bad woman because she's not submissive enough, she's not cooking enough, she's not giving him sex often enough. And it's seen as all right in our culture when you're not doing those things to be punished by a man, which in relationships looks like emotional abuse, financial abuse, physical abuse. And so I am hesitant when I see these articles of, like, sneering at women. It just it doesn't seem like it, but it's such a slippery slope into often getting into like victim blaming and getting to a place where we're like, oh, well, you didn't know better. So, I'm not going to feel bad for you because you're with a man. And that's something that I just hope people are aware of. But overall, I would recommend the article. I think it had some good, interesting things to say. I think it's a good starting point. And I'm really interested in what you guys had to say. So, leave a comment. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're listening to this on Apple or Spotify, don't forget to, give this podcast 5 stars, maybe share it with someone in your life, maybe post it to your Instagram stories. I don't know, but continue to have a good week, continue to have a safe week, and happy first week of November. Okay. Until next time, loves ya. Bye. Mwah.